My name is Renee, and I was 34 years old the first time I understood that family love, for some people, is essentially a performance. Something maintained carefully in public and quietly withheld in private. Something that looks like devotion from a distance and reveals itself as something else entirely when the distance closes and the need becomes real. I didn't understand that then. I would. My son Marcus was 8 years old when he was diagnosed. He was sitting on the paper-covered examination table in a blue shirt with a small dinosaur on the chest pocket. He'd worn it 3 days in a row because it was his favorite, and because at 8 years old you don't yet understand that some occasions require different clothes. He was swinging his legs because they didn't reach the floor. He was humming something quietly to himself. A cartoon theme song, I think. Something he'd watched that morning before we left. The doctor spoke carefully. Measured. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words landed in a specific order and my brain processed them and then offered me, in exchange, a completely useless thought. The shirt needs washing. That was what I had. That was the thought available to me in that moment. Marcus looked up at me when the doctor finished. "Is it bad?" he asked. "We're going to take care of it," I told him. He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to humming. I need to tell you something about my family before I tell you what happened next. My parents, my mother Sandra and my father Gene, had never fully forgiven me for my divorce. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but it's accurate. Kevin had come from a family with money and standing in the community, the kind of family my mother referenced in conversation with a particular warmth that she never quite used when talking about her own. When our marriage ended, when I ended it, after years of emotional absence and financial irresponsibility on his part, my mother received the news with a tightness around her mouth that never fully went away. She didn't say I was wrong to leave. She was too careful for that. She simply became, from that point forward, slightly less available, slightly more occupied, present at holidays, but somehow elsewhere. It was the kind of withdrawal that's impossible to confront directly because it never announces itself. It just accumulates, quietly, until one day you realize the distance between you has become a geography. My father followed her lead. He always had. So when Marcus was diagnosed, I was already navigating this landscape. Already accustomed to asking for less than I needed. Already practiced at reading the particular silence that meant don't push. But Marcus had leukemia. And I had 2 other children. And sometimes you have to push anyway. I was a single mother of 3. Marcus was the oldest at 8. Then Danny, who was 6, bright and watchful with her brother's same dark, steady eyes. Then Theo, who had just turned 4, who still pronounced certain words incorrectly in ways that made Marcus laugh every time without fail. Kevin lived 40 minutes away. He paid child support when he felt like it. He called on birthdays, approximately. He had, over the 2 years since our separation, made it quietly clear that his involvement in our children's daily lives was something he considered optional. My parents lived 12 minutes from my apartment. 12 minutes. I want you to hold that number while I tell you the rest. The months after Marcus's diagnosis were not months in any normal sense. They were a single continuous emergency with no visible end. Chemotherapy schedules, port placements, medications with long names I learned to pronounce correctly because precision mattered and I was the only one making sure nothing fell through the cracks. There were nights Marcus cried from pain so specific and deep that I had no words adequate to respond to it. Nights he was too exhausted even for that. Mornings he looked at me from his pillow with those tired eyes and asked if it was going to stop hurting, and I would smile and say yes, baby, and then walk to the bathroom and press a towel against my mouth so he wouldn't hear me. I was working part-time remotely when I could manage it. A neighbor named Linda, 59 and recently retired, helped when her own health allowed. She was genuinely kind in the uncomplicated way that some people simply are. She didn't need to be asked twice. She didn't need to be thanked elaborately. She just showed up when she could and apologized quietly on the days she couldn't. My parents showed up for one hospital visit in the first 3 months. They stayed 40 minutes. My mother brought flowers, which Marcus was not allowed to have in the treatment area for infection reasons. She seemed briefly offended by this. They left before the infusion finished. My mother hugged me at the door and said, "You're so strong, Renee," in a tone that managed to sound simultaneously like a compliment and a reason not to worry about me. I let it go. I was conserving energy. In the 4th month, I called her on a Thursday evening. Marcus had an extended infusion session the following Tuesday, running late into the evening, followed by an oncology consultation. I needed someone to collect Danny and Theo from their after-school program and stay with them overnight. One night, 2 children who knew my parents, who had slept in their home before, who would not be difficult or frightened in a familiar place. I explained all of this clearly. There was a pause. "Renee," my mother said, "your father and I have plans Tuesday. We're going to Helen's for dinner. We've had it scheduled for weeks." I absorbed that for a moment. "Mom," I said carefully, "Marcus has cancer." "I know that, Renee. We all know that. But you can't expect us to rearrange everything every time there's an appointment. Every time." I had asked them for meaningful help twice in 4 months. She said she'd discuss it with my father and call me back. She didn't call that day. She didn't call the next day. When I reached her Friday evening, she told me they'd decided it was too much disruption. I sat in my car in a gas station parking lot afterward and called Kevin. He answered on the 4th ring. Background noise, voices, music, the warm acoustic texture of somewhere people were enjoying themselves. I told him what I needed. One night. Tuesday. The children. There was a brief pause and then a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Dismissive. Effortless. "Renee," he said, "you're a resourceful person. You'll figure it out." I stayed in that parking lot for a while after I hung up. The mother from Danny's class, a woman named Carol who I had spoken to perhaps 4 times, said yes before I finished asking. She said it the way people say yes when the answer is obvious. Without calculation. Without consulting a calendar. I thought about that on the drive to the hospital Tuesday evening. I thought about it during the infusion. I thought about the 12-minute drive and Helen's dinner, and the word resourceful, and what it felt like to be handed it like something useful while your child was losing weight in a hospital bed. Marcus died on a Sunday morning in early March. The room was quiet. Pale light came through the window blinds in thin strips and lay across the floor in a pattern I have never forgotten. I was holding his hand. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, and also, somehow, completely at rest. I stayed with him for a long time. I didn't want to leave. Leaving felt like the last abandonment, the one I could actually control, and so I held his hand and stayed until I couldn't anymore. My mother had 7 years. I want you to understand what 7 years looks like when someone is quietly, consistently, building a story about themselves. It doesn't happen in speeches or announcements. It happens in small moments. A sigh before answering a question about Renee. A carefully weighted pause after someone asks how the grandchildren are doing. A sentence that begins with "we tried" and ends just before the part that would complicate it. By the time Danny turned 13, my mother had constructed a version of events that had been repeated so many times inside that family that it had acquired the texture of fact. She had been there. She had shown up. She had offered help that was refused because Renee was, as she put it with practiced sadness, always so independent. Always so determined to do everything alone. You couldn't reach her, I know this because Aunt Patricia told me quietly at a grocery store 2 years after the funeral. Not to wound me. Because she thought I knew. Because she had heard it enough times that she assumed it was simply the shared family understanding of what had happened. I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I said nothing publicly. I was working full-time by then. Danny was in middle school. Theo was 9 and building things constantly, small mechanical models with careful focused hands that reminded me so precisely of Marcus's concentration that some evenings I had to leave the room briefly and collect myself before returning. We had a life. It was not easy, and it was not glamorous, and there were months when the budget required a particular creativity and holidays that arrived with a weight that didn't fully lift until they were over. But it was ours. We had built it without assistance and without permission, and it was solid in the way that only things built under pressure become solid. I had a therapist named Grace. She had an office with a window that faced a courtyard. She let silences exist without filling them. She helped me understand, over many sessions, that my mother's narrative was not something I was obligated to chase down and correct in every room it entered. That my silence was not the same as agreement. That surviving was not the same as losing. But I also understood, quietly, that the truth existed. That it had always existed. And that truth, patient and factual and unembellished, tends to find its moment eventually. I did not plan what happened at Aunt Patricia's dinner. Danny did. She came to me on a Tuesday evening in October, 7 years after Marcus died. She was doing homework at the kitchen table. I was making dinner. She closed her notebook and looked at me with the particular directness she had always possessed, even at 6, even in the worst of it. She had always looked at things straight on without flinching. "Mom," she said, "Aunt Patricia's dinner is in 3 weeks." "I know," I said. "I want to say something." At the table. During the toast. I turned from the stove. I looked at her. "Tell me," I said. She told me what she wanted to say. Not dramatically. Methodically. The way she approached most things, with clarity and without excess. She told me she had been listening for years. That she remembered more from when she was 6 than people assumed. That she had watched her mother carry something alone that should never have been carried alone. That she was tired of sitting at that table every year hearing a version of events that bore no relationship to what she had witnessed with her own eyes. She said, "I'm not going to be mean. I'm just going to say what's true." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after she finished. I thought about Marcus. About the blue shirt. About the thin strips of light across the hospital floor. About a parking lot outside a gas station and a phone call that ended with "You'll figure it out." I thought about 7 years of holiday dinners. 7 years of my mother's carefully weighted sighs. "Okay," I said. Danny nodded and opened her notebook again. Aunt Patricia's annual dinner was the family's fixed point. 40-something people in a large warm house, the smell of good food, children moving between adult legs, the comfortable noise of a family that had always believed itself to be fundamentally decent. My mother arrived in her good coat. She had her hair done. She moved through the room with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their own version of history. I watched her from across the room when we arrived. She hugged me. She hugged Danny and Theo. She said Danny was getting so tall. She said it with the warmth of someone who had been present for every inch of that growing. I smiled. I said thank you. I found my seat. Dinner was long and loud and warm in the way those gatherings always were. Wine was poured. Dishes passed. Conversations crossed and overlapped. My mother laughed at something Raymond said. My father sat beside her, quiet as always, following her lead as he always had. Toward the end of the meal, Aunt Patricia called for the table toast, as she did every year. The room settled. Glasses were lifted. Danny stood up. The table took a few seconds to notice. Conversations tapered. Then the room was completely quiet, the specific quiet of a large group of people registering something unexpected. My mother's hand rested on her wine glass. She smiled at her granddaughter with the smile of someone who expects to be charmed. Danny looked around the table slowly. Then she began. "I want to talk about my brother Marcus," she said. Her voice was clear and level. "He died 7 years ago. He was 8 years old, and he had leukemia, and he was the funniest, kindest person I have ever known. I was 6 when he died. People assume children that age don't remember clearly. I want you to know that I remember everything." The room was very still. While Marcus was sick, Danny continued, "My mom needed help one night. She needed someone to watch me and my brother Theo so she could stay with Marcus at the hospital for a long appointment. She called my grandparents." A pause. They said no. They had a dinner to go to. My mother's smile had changed. Something underneath it was surfacing. She called our dad. Another pause. He laughed. He told her she'd figure it out. Across the table, Raymond looked at my father. My father looked at the tablecloth. "A woman from my class helped us that night," Danny said. "A mother my mom barely knew. She said yes before my mom finished the sentence." My mother shifted in her chair. She looked directly at my mother then. Not with anger. With something more precise than anger. With the steady, clear-eyed attention of someone who has waited 7 years to say a true thing in the right room. For 7 years I've sat at this table and heard that my grandparents were there for us. That they showed up. I need the people in this room to know what showing up actually looked like. Because Marcus deserved to be remembered honestly. And my mom deserves to be seen honestly. By the people who were supposed to love her most. She picked up her water glass. To Marcus, she said, who deserved everything. And to my mom, who gave him everything she had, and then kept going. She sat down. The silence that followed was the longest I have experienced inside any room. Aunt Patricia raised her glass first. Slowly and without hesitation. Then Raymond. Then his wife. Then others, one by one, until nearly every glass at the table was raised in the quiet air. My mother did not raise hers. She sat very still with her hand flat on the tablecloth beside her wine glass, looking at a point somewhere past Danny's shoulder. Her expression was not grief. It was not remorse. It was the expression of someone who has been publicly and irrevocably separated from a story they had spent years authoring. The expression of someone who understands, in real time, that the version they constructed is gone. That this room has just heard something it cannot unhear. My father stared at the table. Approximately 2 minutes passed. Then my mother said she wasn't feeling well. She retrieved her coat from the hallway. My father followed without making eye contact with anyone at the table. The front door closed. An engine started. Then quiet. I looked at Danny. She looked back at me. Calm. Steady. Her brother's eyes in her face. 7 years of patience in her posture. I reached across the table and held her hand. Theo, 11 years old, was looking at his plate very carefully in the way he did when he was trying not to cry. He was absolutely crying. I reached for his hand too. My mother called 6 times that night. I answered once, briefly, to say I wasn't ready to talk and would reach out when I was. She sent 3 messages after that. They moved, as her messages always did, from wounded to accusatory. The final one said that a child should not be used as a weapon. I read it carefully. Then I saved it, the way I had learned to save things. Not for revenge. For clarity. For the late nights when grief and guilt collaborate to rewrite memory. Kevin heard through mutual people within the week. He sent a text. Asterisk, really? You let your kid do that, asterisk. I read it once. Deleted it. Did not respond. Some doors you close not because you hate what's on the other side, but because you finally understand that opening them has never once led anywhere worth going. Danny is 15 now. She writes poetry, spare and precise, the kind that says enormous things in small spaces. Theo builds mechanical models with the same quiet focus his brother always had. We have dinners together on Sundays. We talk about Marcus without it being only grief. We tell the funny stories. The dinosaur shirt. The words he mispronounced on purpose to make Theo laugh. The way he hummed cartoon theme songs in waiting rooms without realizing he was doing it. We are okay. Not without weight. Not without the particular absence that reshapes itself but never disappears. But okay in the way that is built slowly and owned completely and taken from no one. I think about what Marcus would have made of his sister standing at that table. I think he would have nodded, unsurprised, in the way he sometimes did when something confirmed what he already understood about a person. He always said Danny was the brave one. He was right. Some truths don't need to be performed or weaponized or delivered with fury to be devastating. Sometimes a 13-year-old girl stands in a room full of people who have been comfortable with a lie for 7 years, holds a glass of water, and simply tells the truth. And the silence that follows does everything else.